We'll continue on this topic with Joshi about Sustainable Development Goals. It's your panel. Please introduce them to the audience.
We're going to discuss a little bit SDG and blockchain. This team of the panel members a little bit intentionally created. One party is from United Nations, other party is from social impact investors. Let me introduce from maybe a social impact investor. Jehan, co-founder and managing partner, Kenetic Capital, particularly focusing on the blockchain investment. And then second, Nydia Zhang, co-founder and chairman, Social Alpha Foundation, again, heavily focusing on the blockchain projects on social impact investment. Now, the Salem Avan, director of UN Secretariat Office of Information Communication Technology. So he covers a quite huge area of ICT in the UN system. And then Marco Baumann, at the end of this row, UN Development Operation Coordination's Office. So he is in the middle of UN reform activities, and he's a UN reform advisor. And then Theresia, UN woman, humanitarian gender specialist. So why don't we start? One of the most frequently asked questions about the UN is, what do you do? So let's start with this question. Maybe Salem, what do you do, or what do you plan to do using blockchain?
Well, what we do is kind of everything. So the UN Secretariat where I work is based on the UN Charter, and what we do is really just approximately 5 things. I use the word just advisedly. So we do peace and security, international law, human rights, development, and increasingly, obviously, the SDGs are very important now. When it comes to blockchain, we know that we can and likely will use blockchain in a whole raft of different areas. We're trying to be very kind of smart and judicious about where we use it. We don't want to use it for each and everything. We know there's very clear examples that are already in play. For example, we know that it's going to be useful and important in the financial area, the supply chain area, and the kind of procurement area, and that's the support area in general. But we also see, for example, we've just been talking to the Panamanian government about firearms regulations, and we know that it would be useful there. We deal with money laundering and systems that support money laundering. We also, in peacekeeping, we deal with disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. We know it will be useful there. Elections. Internal tokenization, because we don't really have a system of incentivization at the UN. So we think that there's scope there. So there's no end of opportunity. What we kind of want to do from our perspective is make sure that the senior leadership understand it well enough that it isn't a fad, that it isn't just used for every single possible thing that's out there. Some cases a spreadsheet is fine, some cases a database is fine, and sometimes we need blockchain. So I think certainly in those sorts of areas of elections, firearm, peace and security, human rights, human trafficking, all of these sorts of areas is where we expect to use it more and more.
Thank you very much for that question. So the UN entity for gender equality and the empowerment of women, we work obviously on SDG 5 on gender equality, but also of course throughout the SDGs we see gender as a mainstream topic. So all blockchain solutions that would work on SDGs would necessarily also obviously need to think about how to mainstream gender. We, as an agency, we started about 2 years ago looking at how blockchain could be leveraged to empower women and girls, particularly in humanitarian settings. And I think that came about as we are entering in an era now where crisis has become the new normal, where we see unprecedented level of displacement and humanitarian needs. So we very much agree with other colleagues that blockchain solutions can help us increase the effectiveness and efficiency of their overall system. But we are also very interested in, of course, of seeing solutions that can particularly also contribute to bridging gender gaps in humanitarian action. And that's where we started looking at some use cases. We started focusing, for example, on the how to build and rebuild the civil and economic identity for refugee women. And I think Mariana did explain this area very eloquently, both the gender dimensions of identity, but also how these inequalities are exacerbated in humanitarian action. And then secondly, we're also starting to look at how blockchain can be used for sending and receiving digital assets. And we know that, of course, women have less access globally to financial systems. 42% of women worldwide are unbanked compared to 35% of men. So in the problem statements, these are all areas that are clearly gendered, and where we see that blockchain could, if introduced in a gender responsive way, help bridging these gaps. So we are right now at the stage where we are very happy to have started to engage in actual piloting. And we have just I have personally just come back from Kenya, from Kakuma refugee camp in the north of Kenya, where we earlier this month did a field testing of a mobile application using blockchain for cash transfers for refugee women. And we have also just entered into a partnership with World Food Programme, joining their pilot in Jordan on their building blocks, Ethereum permission blockchain system that they are using for cash transfers. So UN Women is now also linking our Cash for Work program for women in Jordan to this platform. So I think that's a very interesting initiative, and also something that now WFP and UN Women is working on as an interagency pilot, and where we hope also other UN agencies and other stakeholders will come on board to strengthen this system.
Thank you very much. So Marco, you have a good visibility of entire UN system. So would you elaborate what you're doing and what you do, what you are trying to do?
Yeah, I think what's clear is that without a stepped up, smarter, and also responsible use of technology, we're not going to be able to achieve the SDGs by 2030. So I think that's a realization that's clear across the system. And in order to achieve the SDGs, as ambitious and global as they are, that will require global cooperation. It will require really the smart use of resources. It will require transparency, trust, speed of implementation. And all of these are things that we believe blockchain can help us with, at least potentially, at some point down the line. And at the same time, as Salem has already mentioned, there's also significant potential in actually using blockchain technology for bringing the UN's own internal management culture, systems, approaches up to speed with the 21st century, frankly, because some of those systems are really in desperate need of being updated. So we really see it from both angles. One is, and this is our main outlook in my office, as we work together with all the entities of the UN development system. There are actually 40 different entities. UNOPS, UN Women are two of them, WFP is another one, and there are 37 other ones, many of which have actually experimented with blockchain in different settings and different aspects, some more on the internal management side, some more on the beneficiary, outward-facing side. And we try to, as best we can, work with all of them together and try to incentivize collaboration around a broad range of issues at the country level. And the new technologies and blockchain technologies are some parts of it, and we do provide some startup funding also to interagency projects. For instance, currently we have a project in Central Asia on land registry. That's a pilot between UNDP, UNICEF, and UNODC. And the projects that were already mentioned are big flagship projects that we try to disseminate lessons learned on as best we can throughout the system.
Thank you very much. So as a UN staff, I understand that you have to answer safely always. So more frankly, personally, what would you see as a potential of the blockchain? Or what could be the limitation of blockchain? Not as an organization. Working inside UN, you're looking at all different aspects. What do you really see potential and the limitations? Salem?
I think there's all sorts of technical limitations that we have to be clear on. I think that we have to be very careful about how we use it. What I think is really important is we need coherence in the way that the blockchain is used across the UN entities. One of the challenges for the United Nations, and the Secretariat itself has all of these different mandates that I mentioned, but in addition to that, it has probably 30 or 40 different offices and departments implementing those mandates. Then on top of that, we have agencies, funds, and programs. For us, from my perspective, what's really important where blockchain could be really useful is if we can bring coherence to those efforts. What will happen if we don't is, so we have a blockchain environment, right? Everybody has a blockchain environment, and we're thinking about using it for certain things, but we know when we use it, there will undoubtedly be overlap, and there will undoubtedly be points of integration that we will not leverage. Now, fundamentally, the issue there is that while the organizations will be able to implement their mandate, but the recipients and the actual people we're trying to serve won't be served in the most efficient, effective, and I guess empowering way. So I think, to me, and I was actually given some points on the limitations of blockchain that were mostly technical. I don't think that's something that worries me. What worries me is that we'll implement blockchain, actually multiple blockchains in multiple places that won't necessarily integrate with each other as well as they could. I'm very glad to hear, for example, that there's already these emerging kind of synergies. And I think as long as we have a mechanism to try and really highlight those, and I think the symposium that you've organized as UNOPS, and I think UNOPS has been very much at the forefront of blockchain, I think is a really good catalyst for us to say, there's an opportunity to collaborate. Now, we, for example, have collaborated with UNICEF because we've tokenized our blockchain. We know that UNICEF need help in that. We have the ability to deal with the technology. They have the ability to roll it out more effectively, and we think that there's opportunity and synergy there. But I think that has to go a lot farther than it is. I think that's the one thing that's important. The other thing I'll just mention is that while we talk a lot about implementing blockchain, we haven't really established a standardized process for onboarding blockchain. And we certainly haven't thought about getting off blockchain, mostly because we're not yet on it. But there will be a day when we'll all be on blockchain for everything, and then we'll be thinking, how do we get off blockchain? So I think that we need to maybe think about those things in advance.
Great, thank you. Thank you, honest response. You want to say something?
Thank you very much. Yes, I will add the gender lens to this, of course. I think as UN Women, we are fully behind the idea, of course, that blockchain technology can be a driver of change for the achievement of the SDGs, including SDG 5 on gender equality. But we are also, I think, painfully aware that if blockchain solutions are rolled out without consideration of gender, in a gender-blind way, it can also just as well further exacerbate marginalization of women and girls and disempower women and girls, particularly in the most vulnerable settings, such as humanitarian settings, where I particularly work. So I think we see several things. One issue is around unequal access that I think is very alarming. The gender digital divide that is currently only increasing globally, where women have less access to technology, less access to smartphones, 12% less women have access to the internet, and this gap is only widening. So of course that creates questions in terms of end users' ability to use some of these blockchain-based solutions that I think we all need to think very carefully about when we introduce it. But there are also issues, even when there are solutions that women and men may access equally, there are other gender-related risks that are often overlooked, including the way in which new technology may increase the exposure to gender-based violence, particular privacy protection concerns for women, etc. That needs to be fully understood, that these solutions are introduced in a cultural context of power imbalances, and what are the what, how, and where that we kind of use blockchain in, and how does that affect the end users. And I think thirdly also, it's important that women are part of creating these solutions, and also looking at the overall limitations of blockchains around regulation, international standards, that women are part of creating the solutions for this, because it's only if women are part of that work that women's diverse needs will be reflected in the solutions. So I think we on the one hand we very much see the opportunities of blockchain, but we are also very concerned about the way in which new technologies can also further exacerbate vulnerabilities if not introduced in a gender responsive way. So that's why I think we need to come together, all of us in this room, really, if we want to work on the SDGs, if you want to work on blockchain in that kind of context, we really need to understand what are the gendered risks and limitations if we want to, of course, fulfill the promise of the SDGs of truly not leaving anyone behind.
Thank you very much. Marco, you want?
Yeah, maybe before adding to some of the concerns, let me just share. I mean, I'm just incredibly optimistic about the vast potential that blockchain actually offers for the SDGs and for our line of work. And we've I mean, unfortunately, we can't go into any details on this panel, I realize, but what Sophie has been presented, I mean, this is just astounding. And simply the range of examples that she's given, even in the course of her short presentations across the 17 SDGs, really speaks to the potential that this technology potentially offers. I mean, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, next year, but certainly at some point down the line. And let me just highlight two things that make me or two attributes of it that make me particularly optimistic. I mean, one is really its incredible power to put the agency to the individual. I mean, to really empower peer-to-peer engagement in society and economic life, and rendering this agency to the individual. And this has really transformative potential in many ways. This sounds a bit abstract, but some of those use cases that you have seen really exemplify this. I mean, this is from peer-to-peer energy trading to financial inclusion. I mean, those things already exist. Those actually are live use cases that are already in existence. And a bit further down the line, the whole potential of this tokenization, of tokenized economy, of really incentivizing, which gives us new tools of incentivizing socially desirable behavior in society, which are tools which we are currently lacking, and that I really see as a tremendous opportunity. Second attribute is that it really can serve as a platform for bringing together people in this room, innovators, social entrepreneurs, financiers, and certainly policymakers that can actually action those results. But having said that, of course, as the UN, I think our overriding question for us ought to be, how can we make sure that the voices and the concerns of those people who are affected by this technology, whether it's being invented on the other side of the globe or not, how these voices and concerns are actually fed into the conversation and being heard as the technology is being rolled out.
So overall, the UN is optimistic about the blockchain, recognizing some limitations. Let's ask investors. What, from investors' point of view, among all different innovative technology, how do you rate blockchain when you make a decision on the investment?
So I think, I mean, for Social Alpha, we are not, precisely a impact investment platform. We are just merely a non-for-profit grant-making foundation. So we are, a blockchain-focused, grant-making foundation that primarily support blockchain education, as well as non-commercial blockchain applications that tackle social welfare issues. So, by starting, Social Alpha Foundation, our philosophy behind that is actually that it has been great to hear that everybody's, input into like how optimistic, especially UN, to think about potential blockchain adoption. But from a, speaking for myself, that blockchain, we are still very, very early, and, it's a young technology. So we have a lot of, paths, a lot of kind of obstacles to conquer. And then so, for our foundation, fundamental blockchain study and research, has been one of our major focus. And the other part is that, when it comes to blockchain versus, other innovation, first, I think the most idealistic combination should be, the integration, that blockchain should not be seen as solely a, one and only technology that can benefit, for systems and governments. And the other part I would say I highly value blockchain is actually the accessibility, which means that blockchain as a technology, how, from the level of integration that can potentially help the world is actually quite massive. So, we are talking about from, high level decision making on the government, kind of like a high point, which means that, for different jurisdictions, different regions, we are facing quite, various and serious problems. We have Venezuela, we have, US, and then we have, the entire Asia, and then everybody has, a specific use case. So I think blockchain here can definitely prevent these kind of like unpolitical decision-making solutions, which means that we, set a specific standard and then has a more innovative and open-ended backend that we allowed for different regions for adoption. But on a individual level, what I think is actually also interesting on blockchain adoption is that blockchain has actually provided a quite useful platform for everybody in the ecosystem, like citizens, to truly participate, into efficiently into the ecosystem. We are talking about that, self-incentivization into, everybody's life. Let's say, a very easy example will be a, blockchain D-app, that you can track your stuff and then get your, coffee reward. We are talking about how to, be more eco-friendly on a kind of like a personal capacity. So yeah, so that's, my kind of like, input and then, insight into, this issue.
Jehan, please.
Sure. Yeah, just to kind of add on to what Nydia was saying, I think the other, kind of goal, to add on to this idea that it's very, new, this technology. The corollary to that is that the industry and especially the community around it is also very new. Culturally, as an industry and as a community of blockchain, we're all also trying to figure out like what are we doing and how do we interact and how do we kind of engage with governments and individual problems, retail problems, as well as institutions like the UN. And so at Social Alpha, I think in addition to giving grants and trying to give a lifeline to projects, non-commercial projects, so that there's an alternative non-commercial narrative to development in the blockchain space, I think our most important KPI is being like a cultural change agent for this generation of value creators. If we're able to kind of expand the notion and add narratives to blockchain development, which include sustainability, SDGs, which include things like impact and philanthropy and CSR, then we will have done a very good job about deploying the money that is generously kind of given to us by our donors. So I think that what we're really after is to try and change the mindset of this generation of influencers who are building the protocols and building the kind of infrastructure that will drive this next version of the internet for the next, it will be the foundation of technology for the next 50 years, and then we'll figure out how to get off of blockchain.
So that's a good indication to fill the gap, so-called SDG financing issue. We often talk about the financing challenge on the SDG. The estimated $4.5 trillion every year we have to pour into that work, but the UN budget is not that much, maybe $50, $60 billion every year. So there is a huge gap. In that context, we often talk about how to finance SDGs. So I think it's a good input. We have to fill the gap in terms of communication, right? Yeah. So, yeah, so what
where's the money going to come from? That's the question.
Yes, exactly. We had to, we had to be very creative about that.
Yeah, I think just to kind of take a stab at this, I think one of the initial answers to this question is sitting in this room here. As Nydia was saying about participation and citizen participation, it is about the idea of having a more efficient, more robust kind of layer for things like crowdfunding, which takes it to the next level and actually not only allows people the ability to participate in their own infrastructure through ownership, through signaling. The ownership of a token is a way of signaling, and actually it's there's a guy named Simon de la Rouvier who actually is at ConsenSys, who's done a lot of great writing about this. I love what he writes about this idea of signaling, and the ownership of a token is a way to signal participation and alignment and allegiance to an idea. And in a way, it also aligns the financial incentives. And this is where the money comes from. It doesn't come from all the agencies because you don't have enough money. The government's probably too stingy to give it to you anyway. But it comes from the people. And the way that it comes from the people is by having an elegant and potentially crypto-economically aligned ecosystem of incentives such that everybody in this room will help fund these SDGs because it's in their own selfish interest to do so, and they will do so potentially through cryptocurrency or a tokenized blockchain system. So hopefully that's kind of the, the future that we're heading towards sooner rather than later, because 2030 is right around the corner.
That's great information, great input.
My question for the panel is, have you seen any blockchain projects impact the end users of the healthcare industry today, and if so, how?
The most common use case that we've seen in the healthcare industry is how do we break the data silos that, different hospital systems or, like agencies use, and that's where blockchain, its core value propositions in data governance and synchronous database comes in. But the difficulty in that case is how do you ensure that stakeholders are willing to onboard into that common data ledger, and how do you ensure privacy protection, especially regard to compliance with the law, sharing of the protected health information. That's stuff that we've been studying at ConsenSys Social Impact, actually. So we have a pilot right now. It is still confidential, but it deals with the sexual assault mandatory reporting in California. So how do we ensure that hospitals which have mandate to report sexual assault cases to law enforcement, how do we ensure that report, that correct accountability is located everywhere along the supply chain, that people can track where exactly their case are, like whether their DNAs are being tested, stuff like that.
Just to kind of add on to that, and this actually answers your question, is one of the, and to be fair, I'll disclose this because I'm completely conflicted. So we're advising and investing in this through my VC firm. It's a company called Atana, ATANA.network. And so they're out of Johns Hopkins. And what they're doing is exactly this, because you can't really tackle patient data until you can tackle privacy. And so what they're building is basically, I call it a zero knowledge search engine, but it's a way for companies like pharmaceuticals who are conducting kind of clinical trials to access patient data and patient conditions without any actual, without revealing that information. So these are the types of building blocks that need to be put into place in addition to identity to be able to get to the place where you can, have a more kind of adopted system of patient data. But to Sophie's point, I think that there are a number of different projects in this space that are looking at kind of medical records and that as the first type of area. The other thing that I'll add is your question actually is indicative of a larger question, which is how do we find information in this space? Like how do we find companies around certain areas? And it's great to hear what Blockcase is doing. So for Social Alpha, we actually have just confirmed and will be announcing shortly a grant to a project to a technology and public policy think tank called New America, which is funded by like Rockefeller Foundation, Gates Foundation, to basically build what we hope will be the best-in-class resource for social impact projects using blockchain. One which is very expansive and open, and really hope will be a resource so that when you're looking for projects that are kind of dealing with this, you'll be able to find a very in-depth kind of resource and directory for these types of companies.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yoshi and the panel.